Hello, everyone. Welcome to Kubernetes Attacks, what your cluster is trying to tell you.
And my name is Pawan Shankar, and I'm responsible for product marketing here at Sysdig. Excited to be here with you, Brad.
Likewise, and I'm Brad Geesaman, co-founder of Darkbit, and we're here to talk about ways to improve security detection in your Kubernetes clusters without breaking the bank. Organizations that have adopted a DevOps culture tend to follow a repeatable pattern for shipping software. First, they get it working. Then they deploy it through some form of automation. Ops teams then implement just enough operational monitoring, and then there's pressure to rinse and repeat. After gaining confidence with this pattern, that's typically when some security measures get introduced. For example, code security and vulnerability scans just before new deployments in the pipeline. This can often add unwanted friction. When additional security checkpoints are added, this often increases friction and slows overall velocity. The delicate and nuanced balance of risk reduction versus feature velocity tends to consume a lot of resources from all of the teams involved. And this leaves very little time for focusing on follow-on security activities. And as we've seen firsthand, many organizations have underdeveloped container security detection and response capabilities. So for this talk, malicious activity detection means that when a security incident happens inside the cluster, that activity is captured. All the activities are centrally exported to another location, and the activities are then filtered to form high confidence indicators, and the teams are notified with supporting context. Why is this capability so uncommon? Well, there's a couple contributing factors. Number one, defaults have inertia. Kubernetes defaults are unlikely to be sufficient in terms of supporting security detection needs. When the default configurations are baked into production, the risk and cost of changing them later is much higher. DevOps and infrastructure teams are typically busy shipping and keeping things running operationally, and that's where they're incentivized. Security teams often lack sufficient expertise about containerized environments and common attack scenarios in them. There's actually an education gap. Finally, there's a perception of low risk due to infrequency of security issues. That said, most clusters lack sufficient defense in depth measures that would prevent even a rare security incident from causing serious damage. Security of the environment is a shared responsibility. And if DevOps and infrastructure teams are focused on shipping, and security teams don't have the understanding of what to look for, and there's no pressing security event forcing this focus, we end up with a gap in that middle ground that attackers can take advantage of. So how might attackers take advantage of that gap in responsibility? While it's not an exhaustive list, here are 4 common attack scenarios that Kubernetes operators should be aware of. First, a publicly available API server with misconfigured permissions or even a vulnerability. There are actually bots that scan for this every day. Exploitable flaws in libraries or applications, such as Apache struts or a custom code vulnerability in your actual application code. Third, leaked developer or administrative credentials. This is AWS keys, SSH keys, API keys pushed into public code repositories, or even just plain old phishing attacks against those developer laptops. And lastly, via vulnerable or malicious code dependency in the supply chain getting baked into the image. This could be a Node NPM module, a Python pip module, a Go module, a Ruby gem, etc. We're going to focus on supply chain compromise. There are 2 common ways to bypass the trust in containerized software supply chains. First, you create a dependency and get other packages to use it, and those then get baked into an image. And second, you just create a malicious image and entice others to run it. So we asked, if a malicious container image is run inside of a Kubernetes cluster, what first few steps might a knowledgeable attacker take? And critically, would we even know about it? So we created a default Kubernetes cluster for our first demo environment. As it turns out, not much is available to us for detection without additional effort. The API audit logs, which are activities of access and changes to Kubernetes resources, who made them and when, actually requires additional configuration to enable. The Kubernetes component logs from the processes that make up Kubernetes itself, the API server, the kubelet, kubeproxy, etcd, etc. Those are actually logged to local files on the nodes. And logs from containerized workloads are logged locally to files on the nodes, but they're also not shipped anywhere off the cluster by default. And Kubernetes doesn't have any in-container malicious behavior logs. That's just not part of what its responsibilities are. So essentially, we lack key kinds of visibility unless we SSH into the nodes and specifically look for items or take additional measures to collect those logs. You may have heard about automated attacks that mine Bitcoins as the desired goal of the attacker, but let's be a little bit more creative. Let's run a container image with a malicious dependency via deployment manifest. When the developer deploys that container in the cluster, that's step 1, the malicious image is pulled from the public registry, that's step 2. We'll run a snippet of malicious code, that's step 3, and just enough code to fetch and then run a shell script from my attacker-controlled web server, that's step 4. And finally, in step 5, the actual payload. It'll download some tools inside the container, attempt to enumerate permissions against the Kubernetes API server, and then if it can, create a separate malicious workload that runs on all worker nodes. If that succeeds, that workload will upload all of the secrets from all of the Kubernetes worker nodes to that same attacker web server. Now there's a couple of assumptions. The container image is publicly available, and outbound access from the cluster to the internet is allowed, which is the default. And the permissions for the default service account allow the creation of other pods. So let's see that in action. So the attacker has slipped the malicious code snippet into a code dependency. So let's take a look at that. And as you can see at the top here where it's commented out, it's obfuscated in the bottom, but at the top, we're just pulling in a script from a web server, turning it into a shell script, making it executable, and executing it. And that gets baked into a Docker container.